we can take this investigation, this very practical investigation, and not find ourselves in a dead end, as it seems, when we say, well, actually, from my experience, I don't know what happiness is. What we can do is we can say, I do know what my unhappiness is. I do have access to know what unhappiness for me is. And how we do that is that in a moment when we can put our hand on our heart and say, in this moment, it's not a concept or a theory that I'm unhappy. I am unhappy. No doubt about it. In this moment, I'm unhappy. And if we investigate what that unhappiness is, we'll find time and time again that that unhappiness is one of these 5 forms of what we can call suffering. Guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. So if we're asking, so remember, this is still all just to get a good answer to this question. What am I really looking for in life? We've come to the conclusion where we say, I thought I knew what happiness is. I've been following an instruction that's been coming from me that says your happiness is to be found there. I put my efforts into achieving what the instruction is telling me. I get the outcome that I believe will be my happiness, and it doesn't deliver happiness. And this process repeats itself. So now we're saying, we're admitting, because we're realizing, because we're asking this question and doing a practical investigation, we're admitting something that is important to admit. I have no idea what happiness is. So then we might think, oh, I'm at a dead end. No. Why don't you start looking at what your unhappiness is? That's something you can verify for yourself. How do I know what my unhappiness is? Wait for that time when you can say, in this moment, I'm unhappy. No question about it. And then look at what is going on that is your unhappiness in that moment. And what you'll find is it's one of these 5 forms of suffering: guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation or attachment to outcomes. And now we need to understand what this unhappiness is. It will on the surface appear that your unhappiness is because of the circumstance. It will appear that you are unhappy because of something that someone did that is not in line with your preference. Painful. You will think that you are unhappy because of something you did that didn't deliver a good outcome. That's what it will appear. I'm unhappy because I didn't function in a way that delivered a good outcome. I'm unhappy because the other didn't function in a way that delivered a good outcome. But when we really look at what these different forms of unhappiness are, we will see that it's always our attitude to the circumstance and not the circumstance itself. If we can be seekers, we could be seekers for 10 years, not realize these subtleties that are being pointed out here. And if we don't realize this, we will be seeking without knowing what we're seeking for. Because this investigation is the answer to the question, what am I really looking for? And furthermore, understanding these dynamics becomes the process or method by which certain functions of the body, certain functions of the mind change. Now, the functions I'm talking about that change are not the biological functions, but the psychological functions, the attitude to circumstance. But if we don't realize that the problem, my human unhappiness, is attitudinal, if we don't realize this, what will happen is we'll continue to think it's circumstantial, and we'll continue to insist that circumstance changes. So it's essential to realize my unhappiness is one of these 5 forms of suffering. And it's even more essential to realize that those 5 forms of suffering are always, always, always attitudinal and never, never, never circumstantial. Now, here's another suggestion. The whole thing I've been saying is one big suggestion of what to look at and what to see. The suggestion is human happiness turns out to just be the absence of human unhappiness. Human happiness turns out to be the absence of human unhappiness. So it really means that we are happy when we are not unhappy. Happiness for the human being is peace of mind. Peace of mind is the end of the different forms of our unhappiness. Peace of mind is the end of suffering. Peace of mind is the end of guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation. Happiness for the human being is peace of mind. Happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. What I am really looking for is happiness. If we do this investigation for ourselves, understanding this is the most important question that we can get an answer to. When I ask you next time, what are you looking for? You'll go, happiness. I say, what's happening? So you say, happiness is not circumstantial. That's what I used to think happiness was. You'll say, happiness is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And I'll tell you what that continuous, unbroken peace of mind is, you'll tell me. You'll say that continuous, unbroken peace of mind is the end of suffering. And suffering arises in the form of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And I've seen that when I look at this guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation, I see that it is always my attitude to what is happening in the flow of life. The good news is that our happiness is not dependent on us becoming a perfect human being on the level of our character or on the level of on the biological level. Our happiness is dependent on our attitude to circumstance, which includes our attitude to however we function at any moment. So, if our happiness turns out to be attitudinal and not circumstantial, we need to see what the attitude is that we currently have that creates our unhappiness, and look at the attitude that would need to be there in order for that unhappiness, which is attitudinal, not to happen. The attitude that we currently have that allows these different forms of suffering to arise, guilt, blame, pride, worry, anxiety, expectation, and attachment to outcomes, is what we can call the attitude of doership. And underneath the attitude of doership, we can separate it into 2 sub-attitudes. One is the sub-attitude of doership, under the umbrella of the attitude of doership. And the other is the sub-attitude of attachment to outcomes. So what that attitude of doership and attitude of attachment to outcomes really means is that there is a deeply ingrained belief system, a belief system that we could say is our idea or our belief about who we are. And that belief system says, based on our experience in life. So life has put this belief system in place based on the way that we experience life. And the way we experience life is not really in our control. We pop out of the womb when we're born and we start experiencing life. We were experiencing it life inside the womb as well, but daily life. We pop out and we start feeling cold, we start feeling hot, we start seeing things, we feel hungry. We don't control our experience of life. We don't control what we see. We don't control how we feel about what we see. Not only psychologically, but we don't control the experience that makes us feel like I'm separate from what I see, let's say. So based on our experience in life, a certain belief structure has been put in place. A belief structure that essentially is a belief of who I am and what life is. And the belief structure includes some very specific beliefs that are important to look at in relation to this attitude to the flow of life. So let's look at the attitude of personal doership. The belief there says, I am, Roger is, so my identity, you can see this is my identity because the belief says, Roger is the person. So far there's no problem. Yes, Roger is the person. This is where the problem comes in. Roger is the person who is in complete control of everything that he thinks, everything that he says, everything that he does. Essentially, the belief is Roger is an independent entity in complete control of everything that happens through him. That is a deeply, 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 deeply ingrained belief that when it functions means it doesn't function whereby we know it's a belief. It functions whereby it feels like this is what I am. And our attitude to the flow of life is based on this deeply ingrained belief that Roger is a person with complete control over what he does next. And because that is the deeply ingrained belief about what I am, then that belief system extends out towards a belief about the other. So the belief in personal doership doesn't only see myself as a separate independent entity in complete control of everything that I think, say and do, but it sees the other as the same, a separate independent entity, a person with complete control over the way that they function. Now, it's as simple as that. With that belief in place, when I function according to my makeup, and let's say I have a terrible character, and my functioning in life is according to my makeup, my character, then, and I shout at people, and I get angry, and I fail at getting good results. With this ingrained belief, my attitude towards myself is one of personal doership, and I feel shame. I feel guilt. I have to feel guilt with this belief in place, because then I'll say, why are you not performing better? You're in control of everything you do. Why aren't you performing better? And then furthermore, what happens in life is the other person has exactly the same belief in personal doership. And so when you get angry with them or you break something by mistake. You function and you don't get good results. The other tells you, why are you so incompetent? And when someone tells us this, because we believe we are the doer, we see that our actions have created pain for the other. The other responds to the situation or reacts to the situation and tells us that we are incompetent. And we already believe that. As the doer, we say, why am I not better? So we hate ourselves. When there is the belief in personal doership, we hate ourselves for everything that happens through us that is not perfect. Then the other tells us we're not perfect, and it just reminds us of our hatred for ourselves. And that means that we react to those things, we react attitudinally to those things that happen through the body that are not great, so painful outcomes, painful to myself or painful to the other. We react to them as though I am the doer, I should have acted differently, and we feel guilt, shame, insecurity, worthlessness. When the other does something that delivers pain to us, we look at them in the same way as we look at ourselves, separate, independent doer, and we blame them, saying, you should have done that differently. You could have done it differently. You hurt me. What you did delivered pain to me. It wasn't what I wanted. You said you would pick me up at 12 o'clock from the airport, and you didn't. You left me waiting. That is pain for me. You did that to me. You delivered the pain. And I see you as the doer that could have done it differently, so I hate you. And that becomes the blame towards the other, which is attitudinal. Just like the blame towards ourself, which is shame, is attitudinal towards how we function. Now, this attitude of guilt and blame we could call a psychological reaction rather than a biological reaction. The biological reaction is walking along, so the walking is biological. We might be singing a song, that's biological. We come up to our car that has been wiped out by a truck while it's parked in the car park. We feel all shaken and we swear loudly. Biological. All of that so far is biological. Our attitude towards how we react, where we say, oh, I shouldn't react like this, that's our psychological reaction. That's our attitude to how we have biologically reacted. So we can call our suffering a psychological reaction. We can call the pain in the flow of life a biological reaction. Either pain because of something that happened outside of us, that impacted us, affected or was out of line with our preferences, and so we can call that pain. So that's biological. The biological reaction we have can be painful. Anger, if anger arises, it's painful. And that's part of the flow of life, pain. And our attitude is our relationship to that, how we interpret that. If we have this deeply ingrained belief in personal doership, we're going to judge ourselves. Or, well, we'll either judge ourselves as having acted appropriately, or we'll judge ourselves as having acted inappropriately. If we come across our car and biologically we find ourselves reacting calmly, oh, someone must have come along, smashed my car, I'll deal with it. That's a biological reaction. And we'll say, if the belief in personal doership is in place, we'll say, oh, I acted very well in that circumstance. That's pride. It's a psychological reaction to the fact that we acted calmly. If we act like a maniac, afterwards we will judge ourselves and say, wow, you really acted like a maniac, and that wasn't the right way to go. You're a failure. Now, imagine with this deeply ingrained belief of personal doership, what your attitude is going to be towards the truck driver. With the belief he is the doer, now you have to hate him for the pain that he has caused you. So the attitude that we would have towards the other will be of blame, and that is a story that can carry on for years, maybe our whole life. An attitude of hating the other for what happened through them at a particular point in time. So the biological reaction is vertical. When the situation happens, there is a biological reaction. The attitudinal reaction, which we could call a psychological reaction, is horizontal and extends in time. The circumstance is finished. The other part of that belief system is the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found in the flow of life. So with the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, when we see our car, we see that that is a bad outcome. We believe that that bad outcome, which is pain in the moment, is an attack on who I am, because the belief of who I am, the false self-image, this we'll find out is a false self-image. The belief says my completeness, my happiness, my okayness is dependent on outcomes. So when we see the car, which is a bad outcome, internally we feel like we have been attacked by life. Not only by life, but by the driver, for what he did that delivered this outcome. With the belief that my completeness is to be found in outcomes, my completeness is essentially to be found in life being pleasure, 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 we judge ourselves. We feel that that pain that arose is an attack on my completeness, and we believe that my completeness is dependent on pleasure. Now, this attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, if it was true, if it was accurate, then we'd do this assessment and would say, actually, unhappiness is a fact of life. If we really were the doer and the other was the doer, and if our happiness really was dependent on outcomes, we have to say, actually my happiness as peace of mind is not available, because unhappiness makes sense. Unhappiness is a logical reaction to life. If, however, we do an investigation and we find that upon close examination, we find what happens through me is not in my control. What happens through the other is not in their control. And furthermore, if we start to experience, as a result of this now more focused investigation, we start to experience moments where we find we are happy even when circumstance is painful, we then see the belief that my happiness is dependent on outcomes is not entirely true. We start having evidence to the contrary. What I mean by evidence to the contrary is if we find that there is pain in the moment. Someone has left the toys on the floor. Anger arises, which is a biological reaction. More pain in the moment. And yet, something inside of us now realizes that all of that is a happening based on my makeup, that the biological reaction is pain, but we realize that my happiness is about having an attitude that sees it for what it is. And if this is the case, what we start to find is that yes, there is moments of pain, and yet no uncomfortableness with the pain. No uncomfortableness in the form of guilt or blame or pride. No uncomfortableness in the form of expectation and attachment to outcomes. So then we start to see experientially for myself, my happiness, my completeness is not actually dependent on circumstance, on outcomes, but on my attitude.